Warm welcome to all of our friends out there in the Boss Hole Transformation Nation. This is your host, John Broer, bringing you yet another TBC Flashback. We started doing this toward the end of last year because we had so many wonderful episodes from the early days of the Boss Hole Chronicles. We started this in 2020. And this episode that features Dr. G. Richard Schell was originally published in June of 2021 when he published his most recent book at that time, The Conscience Code. Just a fantastic book and as relevant today as it was then. So let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Schell. He is an award-winning teacher, scholar, writer, and leader at the Wharton School. He is the author of 5 books now. He's written amazing books on negotiations, one of which is required reading at many business and law schools, and his titles have sold over 500,000 copies in 17 languages. Interesting, his legal scholarship has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, and he has taught everyone from Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, Fortune 500 CEOs, to FBI hostage negotiators, Navy SEALs, and United Nations peacekeepers. But my connection with Dr. Schell goes back to when I had him come in and speak to an organization with which I worked years ago, and I just knew he would be an excellent guest and subject matter expert on the Boss Hole Chronicles. So let's flash back to this episode from June of 2021 with Dr. G. Richard Schell, and make sure you check out all the details in the show notes. Let's jump in. The Boss Hole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, a talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode. So, Richard, it is absolutely a pleasure to have you here on the Boss Hole Chronicles, and we can't wait to learn more about the Conscience Code and really just your inspirations for the book itself.
Thank you, John and Sarah. Wonderful to be with you today and to celebrate the launch of book number 5 in the Schell bookshelf. But I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
No, it's our pleasure to have you here. And one of the things that caught me initially when I got into the book, and I saw it in Springboard and your other the book on negotiation, was everything you write is really from very relevant personal experience. In other words, what do you experience not only in the classroom, working with your MBA students, just in life in general, you translate that into something very practical. But what's interesting is the Conscience Code starts with Sarah's story, not our Sarah Best here, but a different Sarah, and really was what I take as the inspiration for saying this story has to be told. Can you just shed a little bit more light on what that spark of inspiration was from Sarah?
Sure. Thank you, John. So I teach a course at the Wharton School that I actually helped to invent. It's called Responsibility in Business. It's a required course, but the students get to choose when to take it. So it's a required course, but it's a little bit of an elective too. They can time it when they want. And one of the assignments I give is for them to bring a story of their own personal career of some challenging moment when their values were at stake or they had an ethical problem that troubled them. And then we share them. And it's a really wonderful opportunity because we have very talented students. They've all had jobs after college, and the MBAs, they're about 28 to 32 years old. So they've been around once. And of course they're gonna go around many other times. But this is the first time they've I think has really reflected on the values that they've been asked to implement, both positive and negative. So this one year, about 5 years ago, a student volunteered to speak, and she was very unusual because she had come to Wharton having already had a career as a lawyer. So she went to law school, she'd gone into law practice, and her story really was that she'd gone from working for a small company as a lawyer to a dream job in a big law firm in California where everything that she dreamed about when she went to law school was coming true. She was well paid. She was a prestigious group. But within a few weeks of getting there, a boss, a boss hole, as it turns out, asked her, sort of on the QT, to work on a little problem that she would like to get some advice on, which is, this partner wanted to hire uh, the son of a Chinese business executive as a summer intern.
Mm,
And she wanted Sarah to do the research on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the anti-bribery statute in America, that essentially would say it was okay to do this.
mm,
And she was told not to put anything in writing. She was told just to do this work for her, not to consult with any other lawyers in the firm. And Sarah was a new lawyer. She just, took the assignment on, but her research disclosed that it actually was very, very close to being over the line of being a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This company had a lot of ties with the Chinese government, and hiring nephews and sons and daughters of Chinese executives had already been sort of litigated as a problem from the American regulatory standpoint. So she went back and said, sorry, my analysis is you can't do this. Whereupon the partner got very angry at her and said, well, go back and try again because there's an answer here and I want you to find it. And so she went back. She actually whispered in the ear of the firm's expert on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act whether he had any suggestions,
right.
without revealing what was going on. And he said, no, this is probably a real problem. So she went back to the partner again and said, I just can't be done. I've done the analysis, I've double checked it, and it can't be done. At this point, the boss started screaming at her
Mm,
that there and people who were walking by outside this office stopped because there was such a cacophony coming out of this office, that she didn't get the message that this was an answer that was unacceptable, and that she had one more chance to get it right and to go back and do this. And so Sarah just was totally shaken. She was
mhm,
quivering. She went back to her office. She sat there for a second. She realized she was so shaken that she needed to take a walk. So she grabbed her purse, went outside the building, walked around the building, breathing deeply, walked around the building again. And then she said, and this was the thing that astonished me and the rest of the students, she said, I realized what I had to do. What I had to do was walk away from this job. And she just kept walking, went home, and never went back to the law firm.
wow.
And I kind of was astonished, but and I congratulated her on standing up for her values and not being complicit in what was essentially both a bullying technique and an attempt to uh, deliver a memo that was against the law.
Right.
But 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 what really triggered it for me was that she walked out,
Mm,
and it seemed to me like that's great when you have the option to walk out. And she was young and she was talented, and there she was sitting in a Wharton MBA classroom, ready to reset her career.
right.
But what about the people who can't walk out? What about the people who need some tools to stand and fight?
Mhm,
So the conscience code really is my, guidebook to standing and fighting, so that you can stand up for your values and advance your career and help the organization to become a more positive place to work for you and everyone else. So that was the spark. The story was dramatic, but it was the missing part of it that inspired me to write the book.
So when I hear that story and having read it and hearing you tell it, what I think about is a person who has the courage of her convictions and who has a moral code. But truly, the word courage comes through being able to walk away, because she has to be in the minority there. I mean, most people would feel trapped and bullied and cornered, and that there's no way out. I am going to have to compromise who and what I am. I hope never to be in that kind of a situation. But you talk now about what are the tools that you can provide people within the book itself. And one of the things that really stands out for me is I love your use of acronyms. And I opened it up to the one where within the conscience code, you talk about the road ahead.
Yeah.
And the word road, it's really kind of the initial, am I wrong? It's really kind of the initial tool, or it's the foundation. And then the codes actually are built within that. And road, actually, I'll just share this with our listeners. The acronym stands for recognize that a value is at risk, own the problem, analyze your decision, and design your action plan. Well, Sarah essentially designed her action plan while she was walking around the building a couple times, right?
Exactly. And her action plan was to exit. I gave her credit, as I said, both because she stood for her values, but also she told her story in class to help others understand what she'd gone through. And uh, the framework that you just described, recognize, own, analyze your decision,
Mhm.
decide to act, is the sort of architecture of the book. So there are 10 chapters, there are 10 rules of the code, but each of the code rules really falls under one of those four letters. And recognizing that a value is at risk seems pretty obvious. Like Sarah kind of immediately had this emotional attack feeling that someone was asking her to do something very wrong. So
Mm.
that's easy. Often recognizing value is at risk is much more difficult and subtle because people sometimes gaslight you and they, especially toxic bosses, will, kind of beguile you into thinking, well, it's just this little thing. It's not illegal. It's, do it for the firm. Take one, show your loyalty.
Be a team player.
Be a team player.
Right.
And so you're sort of beguiled into thinking, well, my value is really not at risk. And so that's where one of the most important parts of that recognition is to understand the pressures and be able to identify them so
Mhm.
that when you feel the pressure being applied, everybody does it. It immediately triggers on a little alarm bell that
Right.
you ought to be thinking twice before you just go along. And then from there, you have to make decisions about, okay, this is a problem. I'm going to take responsibility for it. I own it. And then think about the options. Sarah had one option; she took it. But as you say, many people are trapped in their organization in the sense that they don't feel that there are too many options, and so they have to analyze their options within that context, and then execute the plan. Go ahead and take action.
I have to say too that while she, taking that action immediately is maybe the rarity, you talk about the ethical refugees that, that
Mhm.
disturbing trend you uncovered in your MBA
Right.
classes of people that were encountering, unbeknownst to them perhaps, this subtle and then not so subtle challenge which which shocked me a little bit. I'm grateful though that in your education program, this is a required course that
Yes.
people have exposure to the stories, and the stories help bring into clarity, what they may be experiencing and what to call it.
Well, there's a magical moment in my class when we tell these stories,
Mhm.
because all the students have to come up with one. I put them in small groups. They tell them to each other, so everybody gets a chance to verbalize what their story is. And there's a concept in social psychology called pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance is the tendency, if you have a group of six people and one tells a sexist joke, and the other five people are sitting there trying to figure out, they all are offended by it, but they're not quite sure what the other five people think.
Mhm.
And so their assumption is, well, no one's speaking, so therefore they must think it's funny, or someone's actually chuckling at all, so they must think it's funny. And so, uh, in their confusion over what other people are thinking, they all remain silent. And the sexist gets to think that he told a funny joke, but actually, all five of them were offended by it.
Mhm.
And if only one of them would speak, that would break the ice, and everybody would then be 5-1 telling this person to shut up and to stop being insulting to people,
Mhm.
Right.
but they don't speak. So in my class, I think it happens that, many of them have had this sort of formative experience in their first jobs where they've been asked to do stuff that made them very uncomfortable. Some more, some less. But Sarah's example was probably an outlier on the high end. But
Mhm.
but as soon as people start verbalizing, then everybody else goes, "Oh, you too?"
Yeah.
Uh, and some of them were more successful in their attempts to push back, and that then becomes a grist for the mill of, "Hey, now that I look back on my experience, I realize there were some tools there that I could have used, but I didn't." And so maybe next time I've got some more options that I can think about. So this collective breaking of the silence
Mm-hmm.
of people's sort of ethical dilemmas and how they face them, I think really empowers everybody to start being advocates. And one of the terms that I use in the book that I feel very strongly about is I try to instill an identity for them
Mm-hmm.
that is less fraught than the usual identity for people who stand up for values, because the most fraught term is whistleblower.
Right.
Mm.
And like you have to be a moral hero, you have to go to the New York Times, you have to be this, person who's willing to sacrifice everything on behalf of whatever the value is. And there are certainly some amazing stories and amazing people who are whistleblowers, but the everyday battles in the office, I think, are fought by people I call people of conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
They're people who identify with their own values. They hold their identity as a person of conscience as an integral part of how they operate at home, in their community. And then there's this problem at work where they're sort of feeling alone and a little beleaguered, and they're not sure how to bring that identity to work.
Mm-hmm.
But I try to sort of hold that up and say, look, you're an employee, you're a worker, you're a supervisor, whatever you are, but you're a person of conscience in addition to all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing you should never compromise is your conscience.
Mm.
The scars that it leaves, even subtle compromises of your values, are long lasting. You tend to regret them. And every time you compromise on your conscience, you lose confidence
Right.
for the next time when you'll be called to stand up and speak truth to power. And so the little ones make a lot of difference because they help build your confidence and momentum so that when the larger challenges are there, you have a habit
Right.
of putting that person of conscience identity in the forefront. Now, I think the book is tries to motivate that, but I think just as important is what is the toolkit
Mm-hmm.
to be effective as a person of conscience.
Yeah.
It's not just enough to stand on the rooftop and scream, this is against my values, and then get minimized, fired, or whatever.
Right.
The boss holes have a tendency to know how to manipulate the system pretty well. So
Absolutely.
you really have to meet the motivation has to meet the skill
Yeah.
to gather momentum and to advance the value in an effective way that will reinforce the culture of the firm as a positive place. I'd say the most important single thing in the book on that toolkit is something I call the power of two.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask about that. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean the power of two. What is remarkable about the stories I've heard is so many people tried to take this on alone.
Mm-hmm.
And part of their ineffectiveness was they felt isolated. They didn't feel like they had any allies. They weren't articulate enough to meet the moment. They were outmaneuvered by a sexual predator who was protecting their sexual harassment habit, and so they just withdrew because they were the only spear carrier. The
Mm.
power of two is never take this on alone. So it means you just have to find one ally, one compatriot, one sympathetic ear. First of all, it breaks the pluralistic ignorance barrier because
Mm-hmm.
now you've got one other person there. It also reinforces the fact that, I mean, the social psychology on deference to authority and peer pressure are are famous and reliable. But what isn't publicized as much is that these social scientists who did these formative experiments found an escape condition, which was guaranteed to work. If you want to escape authority pressure, if you want to escape peer pressure,
Mm-hmm.
all you need is one ally to stand up in the room with you,
Wow.
and you get. It doesn't mean you win.
Right.
It just means you have the courage to resist. And then winning is about how skillful are you
Mhm.
beyond that.
Yes.
But the actual psychological motivation in the Milgram experiments, in the Ash experiments on authority pressure and social conformity, both indicate very strongly. I mean, in the peer pressure, the compliance rate, people willing to say things were untrue that were untrue, and they knew they were untrue.
Mm-hmm.
And peer pressure was drawing them to say black is white.
Mm-hmm.
All they needed was one ally in the room who would say, no, black is black is not white. And they then suddenly, to 100%, found the courage to go with what they knew to be true and to articulate it themselves. So it's really important before you do anything and you find yourself in a values conflict at work, is to seek an ally and to consult. Now, there could be an ally at home, and you articulate it, and then you start looking for the ally at work.
Right.
But never,
Wow.
never go it alone. Never walk this path alone.
Such powerful advice.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to reference that you are a scholar. We use predictive index, those behavioral analytics. And thank you for the research and the way you so uniquely put all this together. Some of the things you said just sparked a couple thoughts I just want to share. When people are naturally wired to be collaborative and the fear of risk is so high. So there's one hindrance for being able to speak out and stand up against something. Then you bring in the stakes, real or imagined. In certain situations, the stakes become very high. But it just reminds me, Richard, that no matter how we're wired, we are going to have to adapt. And the values piece is the way to build that adaptation. So and I forget how you said it earlier, but if the values are identified and clear and come first, then it would be more feasible to become more assertive with our voice and our actions, especially if there's an ally in the room. And as we do that, the skills of emotional intelligence assist us. I think most of the professionals I get to meet, we see that they have low self-regard. They could have the most, the highest credentials and the best briefcase on the planet and great accomplishments, but a lot of times inside they're small or they feel small. But what you're talking about brings together, a way to adapt our natural behavioral pattern with skill. First of all, with value, get in touch with your values. Then you provide a roadmap and some skills and tools for each of us to be able to apply that in whatever situation we may face. And there's a lot of them. There's a lot of these awful situations.
Well, I congratulate you guys on your emphasis of sort of personality and effectiveness at work. And actually, in the book, I have a chapter on personality, and I think it's, again, my students have taught me this. You can have great values and even have an ally, and you still might face a barrier that you're conflict averse, that you're simply shy in the face of the potential confrontation that may come with somebody else. It doesn't even have to be someone in power. It could just be someone else. So it's really important to be self-aware that if you have this sort of shyness about interpersonal confrontation or conflict, that's something else you can compensate for by partnering, not with another shy conflict person, but add to your team someone who's got a few more assertive tools that are natural to them, that don't cause them stress as much. And so then you actually are collaborating across personality domains so that you can effectively push the shared agenda of honesty with the client, for example. I mean, a lot of these cases are just, the boss says send the report out, even though the data's not reliable. Why? There's a deadline, and the client won't read the report anyway. So it's easy to talk yourself into thinking, well, the boss knows, I don't know. But you do know. You do know that you're uncomfortable because this is dishonest. You know that the client is being lied to. And but it's going to take not just the fact that you know the value and maybe that your partner on the project also knows that this isn't right, but neither one of you has the personality to be able to confront the boss.
Right.
So now you need to sort of expand the envelope a little to a colleague or a mentor, someone in the firm who has your interests at heart, who can then bring it to the boss and say, the team is uncomfortable with this approach. We understand why it's urgent, but we think we've got a solution that might be able to solve the problem and maintain the value of honesty, strict value of honesty to the client, as the firm mission statement says we're supposed to do.
Right.
And so rally that kind of persuasion process
Mhm.
to effectively assert the value without accusing the boss
Mm-hmm.
of some immoral character trait. I mean, I think that's the kind of tools I try to work through in the book, where you're really just working to solve the problem consistent with your values, as opposed to turn everything into a nuclear war
Right.
where you're accusing everybody else in the firm of being evil while you're the only virtuous one. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's not likely to succeed. But it does take insight. It takes insight into your personality. It takes insight into what your values are, and social awareness that this moment is here.
Right.
So we're not it's not acceptable to just turn away. We have to
Right.
confront it and then decide, okay, I'm going to lead. How can I lead effectively?
Right.
Uh, and often that's with humility. I'm going to lead. I don't have all the answers.
That's such powerful advice for the world right now in the climate that we live in. John, what were you going to say?
Well, so Sarah referenced Richard, in our work with our people science, as we like to call it, predictive index. But when we think about an individual in an organization, we think about the whole person, but we also think about three specific aspects, and we call it the head, the heart, and the briefcase. So the briefcase is just a person's credentials, resumes, knowledge, skills, abilities. The head, that's where our science comes into play, where we can map and diagnose natural behavioral drives. You know, you're a scholar, I'm a captain, Sarah's a persuader. We can also diagnose or map out their general cognitive ability, their ability to deal with complexity. The one that's always been a bit elusive
Mm-hmm.
is the heart. And the heart has to do with a person's core values, their gifting, and really how they approach this world. And as I was reading the book, I'm thinking, and I think about in the chapter where you talk about a personality and some of the questions you ask to help people think or select, okay, where do I see my answers for these particular prompts? Those are all heart issues. And you talk about, fairness, honesty, and integrity. Well, you think about Sarah in your original example, had she really been able to gauge the heart, if you will, or the value structure or moral code, if you will, of that manager or the organization, is that permitted through the organization? Because that eventually influences the culture of an organization. She could have made a decision. It was a dream job, but it's like, this is not the dream job. I'm not going to go here. But she found herself in a position to make a decision.
Well,
So
maybe it was her dream job, and she had her nightmare boss.
that's
Uh,
Right.
true. That's
and
true.
and see, I think the challenge is, if you're a parent, if you're a
Mhm.
father or a mother, and someone says, "Leave your child in the grocery store aisle and come over here with me. We're gonna get some money out of the ATM."
Mhm.
You would go, "Are you kidding? I'm a I'm a father. I'm not gonna leave my child in the aisle of the grocery store alone."
Right.
All I'm trying to do is get people to think of their identities as people of conscience with
Yes.
that same conviction. So when someone asks you to lie, you say, "Really? I'm a person of conscience. How can I possibly do that?" Now, what are you gonna do about it? Okay, that's a nice, interesting, strategic, organizational strategy
Mhm.
problem. And I've got lots of stuff in the book about people managing the organization in a way that leads to the right outcome.
Right.
And maybe the right outcome is that someone does get fired, or maybe in the end, the right outcome is you're in a toxic organization that's run by a criminal enterprise and you do leave,
Mm-hmm.
and sooner the better, and you blow the whistle on them because they're going to do a lot of harm and damage in the world.
Mhm.
So that's the extreme case, but a lot of distance in between, where you can actually work to change the office culture of
Yep.
your business unit, or you can educate people about how they are people of conscience too, and we can create values that we all commit to, that are non-negotiable in the way we conduct ourselves with our clients. And that's what leaders do. That's what we look to leaders to do.
Mhm.
And so as soon as you buy your own identity as a person of conscience, I think that's the heart.
Ah,
Oh, that's a great way to put it. So let me ask a more broad question. When you think about the scope of your experience in the business world, working with business leaders and organizations, as well as students or soon to be business leaders, and I want to go back to that term ethics refugee because it jumped out at me as well. Do we have more of an ethics problem in business now, or is it just more visible, or
Mm.
how would you characterize that?
Great question. Let me draw an analogy.
Okay.
Before the Me Too movement, do you think that there was more than, less than, or the same as amount of sexual harassment
Mm.
as there was the day after someone coined Me Too?
Hmm.
I think there was the same amount going on, but it was like an iceberg that has suddenly surfaced, and it had always been there, but now it was visible.
Hmm.
Why? Because pluralistic ignorance had been broken, and women began to speak up and say, "Me too." So, with the birth of a movement, then the chances come that there might be less of this,
Hmm.
although it may appear that there's more because more people are speaking up. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't happening just because they weren't speaking up.
Right.
And I think ethical violations are part of the dynamic of social life.
Hmm.
There are pressures that come, basically, they're results oriented pressures. And even good people will take shortcuts sometimes under pressure of deadlines, of expectations, of incentives. And we humans have this amazing ability to, in medicine, there's a term called homeostasis.
Hmm.
It's the term that of the body's essential ability to sort of set itself right, even when, after some sort of disruption by a disease or an injury. And I think there's ethical homeostasis too. I
Mm.
think I think um, the tendency of people to push the envelope and to give in to pressure and to yield to rationalization is pretty consistent. And I don't know, you don't have to look further than the book of Genesis in the Old
Hmm.
Testament to realize that there was a little temptation going on there and that people gave way to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's really part of the human condition. But because of that, it's up to each of us internally to realize there's this battle going on between the good angels and the lesser angels.
Hmm.
And
Mm.
it's a battle of values and temptations. And, we have to listen to the better angels and we have to be the advocates for the values against the beguiling voice of rationalization and to show leadership on that because most people, as you said earlier, Sarah, a lot of people are insecure.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And they're insecure not just in self-confidence sort of ways. Everybody, I think, unless they're a psychopath, has a sort of humble sense that there's things that they wish they could be better at or wish they'd done better. But there's a sense of ambiguity about what's more important here. What's the cost benefit analysis?
Hmm.
What's the greater good? And that's not clear. That's not something everybody knows the answer to instantly.
Right.
But when you're a leader for values, you stand up and say, this may be a values problem. We need to think about it more carefully.
Hmm.
We need to get more data. We need to consult more people. We need to make sure we're on the right side of this question before we just act under the pressure of the moment, which is the exigency. That's what. So when I summon people to be people of conscience, it's not summoning them to be righteous.
Right.
Mhm.
It's summoning them to be open-minded and curious and be willing to investigate, to lead toward balancing this dynamic, which I think is internal to human nature. And because it's internal to human nature, it's always going to be there
Hmm.
until we perfect humankind, which I don't see happening anytime soon.
Right.
Then there are always going to be boss holes, and
Yeah.
you're going to have to deal with them. Now, here's fundamental insight that I have had working on this project is the boss holes don't think they're boss holes, and
That's
if
right.
they did, they wouldn't be able to get up in the morning. And this homeostasis of ego uh,
Hmm.
basically is self-repairing. When people engage in bad behavior, they talk themselves into thinking they were pushed to do it, and it really isn't their fault. They're a victim of something.
Right.
And so you're dealing with people who it isn't really good against evil, in my view. It's everybody thinks they're behaving reasonably on some basis or
Yeah.
another,
It makes sense for
and
them.
and
Right.
and And, Sarah's a persuader. How do you persuade people to behave differently? You don't do it by attacking them. You show them that it's in their interest to behave differently.
That's right.
And I think it isn't you turn a boss hole into a saint, but you learn to work with the boss hole by showing the boss hole there's a better way.
Yeah.
That's right.
And a person of conscience just maintains that motivation.
I think you touched upon what I've read about called the fundamental attribution error, where it's our human nature to assign maybe over credit circumstances to our situation. When something bad happens, well, there were circumstances, and don't you know, this is how it went down. But if it's somebody else, it's our propensity to say, that's a bad character. Wow,
Yes,
they made a
exactly.
bad choice.
Yeah.
And you're talking about, becoming a person of conscience. You referred to that as what I would call an inside job. It's an inside job.
Hmm.
So, as part of your MBA class, that's what you're setting out to do. And that's what the book is setting out to do, is to help each one of us intentionally become more of a person of conscience.
Well, I think it's embrace their identity.
There you
I
go.
think they are actually are people of conscience already.
Hmm.
In some part of their life, it's salient. And in other parts, it tends to get either beaten down or submerged, or they draw a boundary and say, well, over here, person of conscience, over there, do what I'm told. And I'm just trying to say, integrate your life and bring the best of you to all of it, as
Oh,
opposed to segment it and let other people control one part of it while you try to, sort of find your soul in the other part. So it's a journey of integration for some, but in the end, I think you feel more fulfilled. You have more self confidence in yourself as a moral person, which is the fundamental part of identity.
Hmm.
I have a colleague in my department who's done some amazing research on moral identity, and she actually had a group of people who have Alzheimer's and they're caretakers, and she gave them questionnaires about when did the person with Alzheimer's stop being themselves. If you're the caretaker, when did that person suddenly sort of disappear
Hmm.
and were they replaced by someone that you just didn't recognize? And interestingly, the fact that a person with Alzheimer's loses their memory or parts of their memory was not the fundamental factor in saying, I've lost grandma.
Mm.
They still saw grandma there. It's
hmm
just grandma with some imperfect memory problems. But when grandma started acting like a different moral person,
yeah.
when she became someone who was always outraged, or when she became someone who was lying a lot, or someone who they just didn't recognize the moral person, that's when they felt they'd lost grandma.
Yeah.
And I think moral identity is the most important core part of who we are. And when we lose that even a little to ourselves, we really diminish the quality of our lives. And we become, if everybody could observe all of our behavior, we become unfamiliar to the people who love us. And so I think that the continuity of bringing your values, your character, your sense of conscience across all domains of your life is really a way of making your life whole. And there's very little that can replace that. Life is short, right?
Yes.
Hmm.
I always, as John knows, I like to say, if you're lucky enough to live to be 90, you get 32,850 days. That's it. Now there may be a life after, in which case, good if you earn it, good for you. But but that's all the number of days you get on this planet,
Right.
Yes.
and so how you spend them, whether you spend them feeling like you're part of the world around you, or in the social community that you're in, or whether you spend them feeling alienated from yourself,
Right.
is a huge opportunity cost. It's one more day on the planet that you don't get to feel connected to the people that you love and who love you in the closest way, in the most intimate way, because you've compromised your values and you can't reveal it. You feel guilty about it. You're
Hmm.
ashamed of it. All these emotions that then become barriers between you and actual connection. And the way you attend to that, it's takes awareness, and you just have to be taking care of it every day. It's not, you don't get a week off.
every day. That is so great. Is it any wonder that I absolutely think Dr. Richard Schell is amazing? I mean,
Mhm.
Richard, every time I'm telling I am going right back to when I heard you talking about Springboard, and it just is energizing and exciting. And I think this piece, this book, The Conscience Code, is so relevant, and I'm so excited for people to read it. I want to remind our listeners that look in the show notes. Dr. Schell's information will be in there. Access to the book, we'll put a link in there. It will be available as of today, June 8th. All those boss holes out there, you would be well advised to get a copy of this. Dr. Schell, what else is coming up for you other than an amazing launch of a book? Is there anything else happening other than the fact that I just want to let everybody know that you became a grandfather just a
I
couple months
did.
ago? Congratulations on that.
Yeah. And that just raised this whole thing for me again. Thank you. My first grandchild, our first grandchild. I've been lucky enough to be married to a woman that I met when I was in college at a Grateful Dead concert many years
I
ago.
remember that.
And so there's a lot of continuity in my life in that department. And then our oldest son had their first baby, little Mira.
Hmm.
And the thing that I realized when that happened, in kind of in connection with what we've been talking about, is the first time we drove down from my home in Philadelphia down to Bethesda, where they live, and we were on the road. It's about 2.5-hour drive, and I've driven that road 1,000 times over my life. The corridor between New York and DC is like a groove, right? And I sensed about halfway down the road that something different about this, and then I realized this is the first time I've driven that road as a grandfather. And I'm gonna meet my grandchild. And it was an identity thing again. I was like, something had happened in my life that added a dimension to
Right.
it,
Right.
and that I had a new part of an identity that, I never had before. And there was a kind of thrill to think that, the envelope. I learned something with my own kids. We had our first child, we loved our first child, it was wonderful. Then we had our second child, and I thought, "Well, is this gonna divide our attention? Are we gonna," and I realized, no, love is an infinite resource. You can
Yes.
it grows with the opportunities, and
Both of
so
those. Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
so here I
Oh,
have a third object of my love, and so I've gotten richer as a result of that by, uh by just having that new relationship in my life, so it's interesting.
man, if
So
our
great.
listeners could see your face light up. I think my eyes are leaking a little bit too. Wow. Such a powerful story. Oh, you're amazing, Dr. Schell. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Sarah and John. Real pleasure to reconnect with you, John, and to meet you, Sarah. And, good luck. Have compassion on the boss holes.
Right.
Yes.
We're here to help them, right?
Yeah.
They just need to be brought to a little more wisdom, and they'll help us.
Maybe they just need to get back in touch with their values too. I think
Sure, I'm
your
sure
book
that would
could be
help.
helpful. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for checking out this episode of the Boss Hole Chronicles. It was so good to have you here. And if you have your own Boss Hole story that you want to share with the Boss Hole Transformation Nation, just reach out. You can email us at mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. Again, mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. We'll see you next time.